It's all about context. I told him. I said to him, it's about context.
I know you did. It's all about context.
Hello everyone. Today I found out that this potato webcam actually has a better microphone than my dedicated microphone. So maybe I should think about upgrading some of this gear at some point. But anyways, the next significant thing I implemented after the basic home screen was this. So I can click on any of these gigs here in this home screen and voila, it comes up in my gig list and I can deselect them here again and they disappear. Pretty cool, right? So in my mind, the minimum viable product for this project was to have a full list of as many gigs as possible from external data sources, regularly updated, then users could go on and say, I've been to this one, this one, this one, and this one, and then have that list recorded. There's the rest of the features, and there's plenty of them, can come later, but that is the core idea. So with that in mind, at this point, I thought I should work on letting the users record the gigs that they've been to, as I just managed to do something similar in the pizza tutorial that I've been doing alongside this. So let's take a look at what I did, why it works, and why it was actually very, very wrong. So let's take a look. All right, just give me a second to get my screens sorted out. Whee! Okay, let's move myself over here and right, we're back. As I was saying, the main development at this point was to allow the users to select any gig that they want on the home screen and have that generate a separate list on the My Gig screen. I did that using the context API within React, but as it turns out, that was completely ridiculous and doesn't suit my use case at all, which is something we'll talk about a bit later. But it's all good learning, right? So what is context and why use it over use state? Well, context allows you to share your state across your app without having to pass it down through individual components with props, otherwise known as prop drilling, which is what's shown in this diagram here. So if this child component wanted some values from the top level, it would have to be passed down through each of these individual components every time, which is not very efficient. But by using context, you can have your state handled in a context provider, which shares it directly with all components. So if we take a look at the diagram, we set the properties in the context provider, and that shares the values with all of the components by wrapping it in a context provider. And then each individual one, if they need to, they can access the values directly from the provider. It keeps things simple and it's more efficient as it passes the values directly to each component without having to drill through each of its parent components like we saw in the last diagram. However, it is generally advised that context is only used for small applications, as it causes every component that consumes the context to re-render. And if you've got a large context that serves a lot of components, that can start to impact performance. So for proper state management on larger scale apps, you should probably use an actual state management library like Redux. Context main purpose is to avoid prop drilling. All right, enough of the lesson. Let's take a look at some of the code. All right, so the main thing in this build is the gig context file. And going down it from the top, after the imports, I defined a gig type, which should really be taken from the types file, but it's a work in progress. And the type for the gig context. That is made up of an array of gigs, an array of selected gigs, and a toggle gig selection function. So those are the three things that the gig context is always going to contain. The main thing in this build is the gig context file. So going from the top of that, after the imports, I define a gig type, which really should be taken from the types file, but here we are, and a gig context type. And that is made up of an array of gigs, an array of selected gigs, and a toggle gig function. So those are the three things that the context is always going to contain. Next, I create a default instance of the gig context, and then it's the gig provider function, which is where the real magic happens. So within that, we've got two use states. One of those contains a full list of gigs, and the second one contains a list of selected gigs. And then we have the actual toggle gig selection function. And what that does is it takes in the ID of the gig that's been selected, and then it checks to see if that ID is included in selected gigs list already. If it is, then it filters it out of that list. And if it isn't in there already, then it adds it in using the spread operator. And then it takes that updated selection and sets it to be the new selected gigs list. What's returned from the function is the context provider that contains the full list of gigs, the selected gigs that's been updated, and the toggle function itself, and it provides it to all the children. The use gigs function down here is a custom React hooks that are created, and basically all it does is provide a convenient way to access all of the values stored within the context provider. And it just wraps and encapsulates all of that logic into this use gigs hook. So all of the other components can call it and access all of the state and functions within like easily. So aside from the gig context, some of the other updates to the files in this build include the root layout file. So as I mentioned before in the diagram, if you want to be able to share all of the values within the context provider, it needs to wrap all of the components that it wants to share to. So we do that here. You can see gig context provider is wrapped around everything in the app. So all of the components within that have access. And one of those components is the new gig item component. So maybe you didn't watch the last video, but the gig item is basically what renders each of these individual gig items here on the homepage. But this updated version, what it does is we get access to the context provider using the use gigs custom hook that I created that I mentioned a minute ago. And from that, we destructure it and we take out the selected gigs and the toggle gig selection function. So we can use those in this component now, and any changes get passed back up to the provider. Cool. So after that, create is selected, which is just a check to see whether the gig ID in question is already in the selected gigs list or not. And that is used down here. So we run a check on that. And basically what this is the icons here. So if is selected is true, then the icon will be a tick. So that means it is already in the list. And if it's not true, it will be the plus, which means it's not in the list. Next thing we got is the handle press, which just basically runs the toggle gig selection function. And that is just applied here. So anytime you press any of these items, it doesn't need to be on the icon there. It will run the toggle function. And finally, these items are then displayed in a new flat list. So not this one on the home screen here, but if we click on those, this flat list here, and that is called My Gigs. So what we're doing in here is, again, we are taking the use context in the shape of the use gigs custom hook, destructuring it and pulling out the full list of gigs and the selected gigs. The next thing is then to create this list called My Gigs. What that does is it just filters out the full list to only include the gigs whose IDs exist in the selected gigs list. Now, the reason for that is that the selected gigs list only contains the IDs. So it doesn't contain all of the information like the artist, the venue, the date, etc. So if I just displayed the selected gigs list, it would just be numbers. So what I need to do is then basically match that up to the full gigs list, which contains all that data, and then show a filtered version of that. So we've got a context provider that handles the state of the full list, the selected list, and the toggle function, which is then used by each gig item and the mygig list. So we've got a context provider that handles the state of the full list, the selected list, and a toggle function, which is then used by each gig item and the gig list. So they're the main things in this build. There are a couple of little bits like the header and this empty profile page, but yeah, getting this my gigs list up and running was the main thing I achieved at this point. But like I said earlier on in the video, context works in this situation, but it's actually not what I need. It's almost just like a proof of concept, and I kind of did know that at the beginning because I wanted to get this up and running even though I didn't have the back end working yet. But context will only persist for as long as the session's open, which is obviously useless for real world use. And as I was going through the project, it was actually a while before I took a step back and rethought this approach, which in hindsight is kind of obvious, but here we are. You could call this implementation a waste of time then, and technically you'd be right. I guess it comes from being a first time learner and rushing to implement what I just learned from the other tutorial I was following at the time. But on the flip side, if I didn't implement this, I would have gone past context with a rough idea of what it was and likely not known enough about it to know when to use it in the future and exactly what it's for. So if we consider that the main point of this project is for me to learn, in that regard, you could say it was a success. So with that, I think we can call it a day for today. I'm going to go and watch Spurs get battered again, probably. So yeah, thanks a lot and see you in the next one. Well, turns out we didn't get bad, but hey, it's only United.